Okay guys, I am making, this video is about basics of L5R. It's a really complicated game and I see people make mistakes, like crazy mistakes, all the time. And it's really hard to come, like there are a lot of mistakes you can make in this game that are just really hard to come back from. For example, I played against a game last night where I almost lost the game, but only because I was playing kind of stupidly. And I assassinated his two-fate brash samurai twice in the same game, and then I killed his guest of honor with a Shoju Yunako combo. Now, granted, he was a newer player. Maybe he could have done stuff about that if he'd noticed the interactions. But in the hustle and bustle of combat, it's really easy to forget stuff, to make mistakes. Yeah, don't let that happen to you. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is a clear game plan. And I have mulligans in you, a clear game plan. Now, the most important question that you should be asking yourself when you're deck building is, what does my deck do? Right? So I'm going to use, the example is this deck called Ambush. This is what I'm using in the Discord League. It is probably not the best Scorpion deck that exists, but I like it. And so that's why I run it. I think it's a cool deck. I think it's interesting, and I think it's good enough to that it can beat a lot of people. And I've played it into the Dragon Crab Voltron meta deck, and it's pretty good. It's got strong things. So what does this deck do? I've got 2 copies of Ambush, 2 copies of Charge, and so I've got 6 conflict characters, 3 of which are Adepts of Shadows, which is a very unusual choice in Scorpion, but it's basically an infinite 2/2. Yes, my opponent can assassinate it, but honestly, if they do, that's probably a big loss for them, because I'm basically playing a Dishonor deck, or it's certainly a Dishonor Break hybrid deck. And so when they use Assassinate, I'm usually pretty happy about it. But I do want to have multiple Adepts of Shadows. They're good for, sometimes I need to cast 2 of them, or sometimes I need to play 2 of them in the same conflict. They're good for ambushing in when I have like a 4-cost and no other 2-costers in my provinces. And they're just generally really, really utilitarian 1-costs. The goal of this deck is to pass first every single turn and accumulate a resource advantage, and then play characters cheaply with Ambush and Charge in order to take advantage of that resource differential. I'm running a Mountain Does Not Fall because I think it's a really good card, and because it combos well with charging or ambushing Shoju into a combat, and then Mountain Does Not Fall him. I'm also running the full Dishonor suite of 3 Way of the Scorpion, or almost full. 3 Way of the Scorpion, 3 Forge, 3 for Shame, 3 Court Games, and 2 A Fate Worse Than Death. I was running 3, but I changed 1 for I Can Swim because I'm playing in an open list format, and in open list formats, it's better to have 1 I Can Swim so that they never know whether or not you have it. 3 Calling Favors because I think that attachment heavy decks are really strong, and they're one of the matchups I'm concerned about. 3 Bonsai because it helps me break, and I am fundamentally running a breaking deck. 3 Cunning Magistrate because of the way he interacts with Dishonor, and he's really, really strong in a mid to late game breaking strategy. If you've already broken 3 provinces and you still have several Dishonor cards in your hand, you can make it really hard for them by dishonoring everybody on the board and then attacking. And then this is a little bit of an unusual Dynasty deck. I have no Illusionists, or sorry, I have no Sinister Soshis because they can't participate in conflicts and I can't ambush or charge them. I have no Outcasts because I'm not running Assassinate, which is really weird for a Scorpion deck. But and I have a lot of cheap guys, and then I have a lot of expensive. I have a bunch of cheap guys and a lot of expensive guys. So I'm not running. I guess I'm still running a bunch of 2-costers, but and I'm running 3 City of Lies because I have so many expensive events and events that cost 1. 2 Back Alley Hideaway just because it's good, and 3 Favorable Ground. Also really combos well with Ambush and Charge, so I can charge and Shoju, Favorable Grounds them out to use them later. Instead of Cloud the Mind, I have 2 Oni Masks, and of course 2 Fate Worse Than Death sometimes fulfills the purpose of Cloud the Mind. This is a nice military buff. I can play an Out of Shadows with a Fate on it, use it Oni Mask, or keep it around. And then Pathfinder's Blade because it protects me from a lot of things, and Ornate Fan because I'm good at breaking politically. So what does this deck do? This deck tries to break aggressively in the early game. If my opponent is running a pump deck, he's probably going to, it depends, if it's like Phoenix or Crane, then I often can break because they have high glory values, and my Dishonor tech reduces them to very low force. So I often can break. But Sometimes they put a lot of resources into defense, or they just have more pumps than I do. And in which case, I won't commit super heavily. I will just poke and try to get them to bait them into wasting resources, and amass my own resources for the mid and late game. By starving them out of fate, by passing first, and by using Ring of Earth to create a hand differential. Ring of Fire, I go after Ring of Fire a lot with this deck because I want every single character on their side to be dishonored. That's another thing. Mountain does not fall with Cunning Magistrate when they have a bunch of dishonored people is pretty hilarious. So, and so my plan is that I'm gonna get out one guy on turn one. I'm really looking for a liar or a manipulator. Rumor monger or illusionist is okay, but I really want a courtier because I want to threaten to be able to use Forged Edict. Even if I don't have a Forged Edict, I want to be able to counter things if I draw one, or I want my opponent to think that I could counter things, or wonder if I can counter things. So I'm really mulliganing for a City of Lies because I want to play all these awesome events. And then either liar, manipulator, or a rumor monger is what I'm looking for. Then in my conflict side, I'm looking for one Adept of Shadows. I'm looking for a Pathfinder's Blade. I'm looking for a Forged Edicts, and I'm looking for an ambush. That's what I'm mulliganing for. And sometimes, depending on the matchup, I'll also mulligan for a Fate Worse Than Death, like against Dragon. That can be really good if they get the Nintendo Master out turn one. Fate Worse Than Death him. He gets pretty sad. Sometimes I'll keep, depending if it's like Phoenix or Crane, I will keep the Way of the Scorpion because it's extra powerful against those factions. But in general, I would actually much rather mulligan my Dishonor cards early because it's in this deck, it's better to use 5 Dishonor cards on turn 3 than it is to use 1 on turn 1, 2 on turn 2, and 2 on turn 3, because it makes the Cunning Magistrate super powerful, and you just want to get to the point where you just take over the game. And like ideally, what I really want to do is break 2 turn 1, break 1 turn 3 or turn 2, I mean, and then finish them off turn 3 with the Cunning Magistrate. But it just doesn't happen that way a lot of the time, and so when it's not going well, then I want to break 1 turn 2, 2 turn 3, and finish them off turn 4. Obviously, I'd like to go second in this deck because I'm trying to resource snowball. What I really want to do is go second and then pass first. That is super powerful. Okay, so that's my game plan, right? My game plan is poke early, break if it's free, right? That's my motto. Break if it's free. Like, I'm not going to get into a resource war where I trade my whole hand for their whole hand, because my whole hand is better when I use it all at once than it is when I basically if I'm not sure I can get the break, I often won't go for it. I will ambush and charge early if I can. Like I've often charged in a Shoju and Mountain Does Not Fall. That's super powerful turn 1 because he's almost certainly going to break by himself, no problem. But I'm not going to spend like a crazy amount of stuff trying to break turn 1. Really, I'm just trying to find out his provinces are safely. I'm trying to poke. I'm trying to get ring effects. Especially Ring of Earth, Ring of Void, Ring of Fire are the effects that I'm really looking for. Yeah, that's my game plan. Okay? All right, so what do I mulligan for? As I said, so mulligan, I'm looking for liar, manipulator, or rumor monger. I want one low-cost character. I'm going to put it out with 1 fate, and then I'm going to pass almost all the time. Even if I don't have any conflict characters, attacking on the first turn is not super valuable. It's not bad. It certainly can snowball the game, but because you're not getting any fate, it's often better to wait till the second turn. So even if I don't have a conflict character in my hand, I will often just get 1 character out, and then maybe I'll, if with luck, I'll either draw a conflict character in my first 5, or maybe a charge or an ambush, or I'll draw an answer to whatever 2 characters they have. It's okay if you get a little behind turn 1 as long as you have a significant resource advantage, because you got to think if you're going into turn 2 with, let's say I went second, I got a liar with 1. So I have 6 left. Then I passed first, and I have 7 left. Then in turn 2, I'm going into turn 2 with 14 fate. Now, that's going to be really hard for a lot of people to deal with. They don't know what you can play. You can still, and even then, I'm probably still going to buy, now I'm going to buy, a Shoju with 2 and have 7 left. And then try to pass first to get 8. That's really what I want. That's the game plan I'm looking for. Okay, so when you mulligan, you got to mulligan for, there's 2 things you mulligan for. First of all, what's my ideal game plan? Right? Like if you're playing Crab, you're probably mulliganing for Steadfast Witch Hunter and Caillou Envoy. If you're playing Dragon, you're probably mulliganing for Nintendo Master or What else is Crab mulligan for? I don't know. I don't play Dragon. If you're mulliganing for Phoenix, you're probably looking for Adept of the Waves or Prodigy of the Waves. There's stuff. You got to know what your strongest first turn looks like and how to get there. And then in conflict, again, it does depend. Like against Crab, I'm mulliganing for. I'm going to keep calling in favors because they're probably going to play a super annoying attachment turn one. Dragon, I'm mulliganing for a Fate Worse Than Death because they're super fucking annoying on turn one when you can't deal with their shit. But against just my general and a Pathfinder's Blade against Dragon and Lion, especially because and Scorpion, they have super brutal province suites. I'm definitely mulliganing for Pathfinder's Blade. But in general, I'm looking for the Adept, the Blade, Edicts, and the Ambush. Sometimes I'll keep Bonsai. That's pretty good turn one. Okay. Fate on characters. Okay, so I see a lot of people making what I consider to be big mistakes with Fate on characters. First of all, you should not be bringing out people with no fate unless you have a specific reason to do so. Like sometimes you're like, I really need to swarm this turn and this is what I have to do it. Or sometimes you're like, they have a Jade Tetsubo or Kazue and I can't afford to put fate. Or sometimes it's like a Vanguard warrior and you're gonna sacrifice it anyway. The reason you should not be putting characters without fate is first of all, getting even in a one cost. If I put down 2 1 costs with 1 fate on turn 1, which is okay, I don't tend to play that way in this deck, but that's a fine play. It means that I can pass first without playing a character on turn 2 and still have 2 1 costs. So that's much better than playing 2 1 costs on turn 1 with no fate and playing 2 1 costs on turn 2 with no fate. Now, it's not terrible. I used to play characters with no fate on turn 1 a lot because it does give your opponent this nice challenge of like, well, you can either take the Void Ring for no benefit or I will take it for benefit. But it also allows them to take the Water Ring to mess up your plans, which sometimes doesn't matter, but often it does matter. And being able to pass, having a board state on turn 2 when your opponent doesn't have a board state on turn 2, start turn 2, is pretty good. I highly recommend it. So in general, this is like if you don't have a specific reason to do it this way, other than this way, almost always do it this way. If it costs 1 or 2, 0, 1 or 2, you put 1 fate on it. If it costs 3 or more, you put 2 fate on it. Unless you really can afford to put 3 on it and it's going to win you the game if it doesn't die. So 3 is okay, but usually just the way the fate works, oftentimes you need fate. So, 3 with 3 on it, 4 or 5 with 2 on it, that's your ideal. Or 3 with 2 on it is fine as well. Right? So you almost always put 1 or 2 fate on things depending on how much they cost. It's not worth putting 2 fate on a 2 cost unless you can protect it from the assassinate, because if it gets assassinated before you get to use it, I'm not saying you 100% lose the game, but if your opponent makes no mistakes for the rest of the game, you probably lose the game just off of that. It's just such a big fate swing, because if you lost 4 fate to my card plus 3 honor, it's just not a good trade for you. And it's a pretty significantly not good trade for you. You also should be aware what decks run Assassinate. Lion often runs a couple of them. If you see all the Obstinate Recruits and the Venerable Historians and Steadfast Samurai, then they're probably not running Assassinate because they're probably running an Honor Runner deck-ish. But Crane will often run 1 or 2 because they have extra honor. Scorpion will often run 1 to 3 because they it's hard to dishonor them. Crab will often run 2 or even probably just 2 because it combos well with Way of the Crab. So a lot of decks run Assassinate, and you should be really aware of Assassinate. You never want to get something assassinated with 2 fate. You also have to realize that, depending on what faction you're playing, at least in Scorpion, I love it when people assassinate my guys for the most part. Sometimes it's annoying, but oftentimes I'm like, okay, cool, I'm going to dishonor you. Good luck. All right, how do I decide who to bring out? Again, this goes back to your game plan. My game plan is to show weenies on the board and hold most of my power in my hand. That's my game plan. You might be playing a Voltron deck, in which case you want that Voltron. You want the Voltron and you want any important support characters. So like in Dragon, that would be the Agasha Swordsmith or the Doom Shigenja. And the Doom Shigenja is not actually what a quote support character unquote, but it's a 3/3 for 1, which forces them to devote resources or get fucked. So it kind of acts like a support character. A lot of the times, turn 1 especially, it is 100% fine to get one guy out with 1 fate on it and then just call it a day. Because it's great to go into turn 2 with a lot of fate. Going into turn 2 with 10 or 11 fate is very, very strong. And if you can survive that first turn, like there's nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with being a super aggressive deck. And if you have the hand for it, if you look at your flop and you look at your hand, you're like, yeah, I could totally take 2 provinces this turn. I've got a Nintendo Master. I've got 2 fine katanas. I've got whatever. Like, go for it. But if you look at your hand and you got like, okay, well, I've got like court games and I've got, like a calling in favors and an ambush and a mountain does not fall. I mean, I'm probably not going to take 2 provinces. It's okay to just get one guy or maybe 2 cheap guys, but really one is better a lot of the time, and then just defend. Or like attack with like a water ring to bow one of his guys, force him to defend, whatever. All right. So how do I decide to bring out? You either bring out your win condition. That'd be like the Steadfast Witch Hunter and Nintendo Master, all those really, Prodigy of the Waves. Like a lot of these guys, you notice the theme is they get to attack more than once. So that can be your first one. You do have to be careful about which faction you're playing against. If you bring out your Witch Hunter and I Fate Worse Than Death him on turn 1, you're going to be pretty sad. So you got to be really aware. Like sometimes that's another reason not to bring out the big guns on turn 1, is that you don't have the resources to protect them yet. So it's easier to protect them when you have like 10 Fate and 14 cards or whatever. All right, bidding for fun and profit. You should, depending on who you're playing, you should often bid 5 on turn 1. You should almost never bid 1 on turn 1. The reason not to bid turn 1 on turn 1 is if you bid 1 and they bid 5, you are down 4 cards, which allows them to very easily win 2 rings and deny you any ring effects. Now, that's not always guaranteed, but that will often happen. And if they do that, you lost most of your advantage from drawing 1. So you should almost, if you want to pressure the dishonor, bid 3. They still lose 2 honor. They still give 2 honor to you. And then bid 3 again the next turn. Because the thing is, like, let's say you bid, and if you're going to bid 1 both turns 1 and 2, like, you're probably just going to straight up lose because you're down 8 cards, and 8 conflict cards in this game is just crazy. That's like, an average of 16 force. You're just going to lose every single combat and die. Probably, unless you have a very special deck that really is, that's your game plan. Bid 1, like, the old Lion Dynasty, like, bid 1 hit Ring of Earth deck, which, doesn't work as well anymore, but it did work pretty well in 3-core. People learn to play around it. So if you bid 1 on turn 1 and 3 on turn 2, and then they're at low honor, so now you just both bid 1 for the rest of the game. Because we're assuming they bid 5 every turn, right? So you're going to bid, well, let's just say you bid 1. The thing, okay, you get into this trap where you bid 1 for the first 2 turns, right? You're down 8 cards. Now they can't bid above 1 for the rest of the game or they die. So now you both bid 1 for the rest of the game. And the thing is, like, you can never bid more than 1 because you just erased all of the pressure that you created by getting your ass handed to you for 2 turns in a row by not having any cards, right? It's better to bid 3, then bid 3 again, then bid 1 for the rest of the game, because when you both have, when you have 10 cards and they have 14 cards, the 4-card difference is less meaningful than when you have 5 cards and they have 9 cards. Like when you have 5 and they have 9, they have double your hand, basically. When you have 10 and they have 14, they only have 30% more cards. And it's also more likely that you've seen the key cards that are, if you're playing a low bid deck, you have extra value cards in your hand, like, like things like a Fate Worse Than Death or Ambush, cards that are going to do a lot for their cost, because that's what allows you to get, extra value out of a single card, is by paying a lot for it. So if you're going to bid 1, don't, is my advice. Is you should usually be bidding 3 if you want to pressure dishonor. Bid 3, then bid 1 for the rest of the game. All right, Ring Choice 101. You should be primarily focusing on Void, Fire, and Earth rings. And you got to understand what each of these rings means to you. You got to keep in mind that the rings are twice as effective as they seem, because good players will also focus on these rings. And so every time you take the Earth ring, or even every time you attack with the Earth ring, And sometimes they're gonna like bow your guy, not defend, and then it goes back into the pool. But usually it's gonna get claimed. Every time you claim the Ring of Earth, you draw a card, and they discard a random card. And every time you claim the Ring of Earth, they cannot claim the Ring of Earth, or they cannot claim it on offense. And so you do not have to discard a random card, and they do not get to draw a card. So it's in many ways a 4-card swing, because the Ring of Earth is probably the most effective ring overall in many, many, many scenarios. Um, because there are cards in this game that are not meant to be used early, right? There are cards in this game like calling in favors. Like, you can use it early. There's nothing wrong with using it early. But if the spyglass that you need to steal doesn't show up until turn 3, you really want to keep that calling in favors until turn 3. Or Forged Edict, right? Like, yeah, I can counter all your spells on turn 1, but a lot of the time I'm waiting for turn 2 or 3 to counter the very important spell that I think is going to come at that time. And so if you can random discards is just very powerful in this game. And it's a free random discard. And things like Spies at Court and Policy Debate exist, but they take up deck slots. And, Policy Debate is a great card that is completely not worth it most of the time if you ever have to pay honor for it. Like, it's only a good trade for you if you get it by bidding 1 and they bid 1 as well. Well, or obviously if they bid 1 more than 1 is pretty good for you. Because if you give them even 1 honor, you lose an honor, so you can draw 1 fewer cards in the future, and they gain an honor, so they can draw 1 more card in the future. So you're trading a card for their card, and then giving them a card and taking away a card from yourself. That's not a good deal unless the card that you took with Policy Debate was going to win the game for your opponent. So you have to be very careful with Policy Debate. And then Spies at Court, it's like, yeah, it's a good card, but I mean, I could just use the Ring of Earth instead and then put a different card in my deck, which helps me win the Ring of Earth. And that's usually, if they're playing a deck of cards that help them win combats, and you're playing a utility deck of cards that are useful after you've won combats, well, you'll see what happens. Good luck with that. Okay. So Earth is very, very strong. And then Fire is also very strong situationally. Like against Crab, you probably don't want to take Fire that much. Or against certain kinds of Unicorn. Against Scorpion, like Fire is really good if they have only 1 courtier, but not as good if they have 3 courtiers, 2 of which have 0 glory. You got to really understand what Fire means to you. If you've got some 2 or 3 glory guys, Fire is great. If they've got some 2 or 3 glory guys, Fire is great. Fire and water are very interesting. Okay, so all the rings are similar, right? Like Earth and Air are functionally similar. They both make you lose 1 honor, quote unquote, and they give you 1 honor and they make your opponent lose 1 honor. Or the Ring of Air grants you 2 honor. But in this game, honor is often like a card. A card is worth giving an honor to your opponent in the bidding phase. And so Ring of Earth discards a card at random and gives you a card that's very similar to the Ring of Air. But the Ring of Earth is better almost all the time because it has an effect now. Whereas the Ring of Air only has an effect later, either because they can't afford to bid as high or because you're trying to dishonor them and kill them by actually getting them to 0 honor. But you got to remember the Air Ring is not useful until you actually get them to 0 honor or you change their gameplay behavior because they're at low honor. So the Earth is much better in general. And also you can snipe out important cards from their hand with Earth. Fire is very, it's going to be really important in some matchups. Interesting thing about Fire, so Fire and Water are similar. Because the thing about the Water Ring is you often are attacking with it. Sometimes you're defending with it and then trying to unbow your own guy. That is really good. But a lot of time, the way I see the Ring of Water used is I'm attacking with it so that if you don't block, then I get to bow your guy. So you might as well block. And you don't, you'd rather be attacking me at this point in the game. So that's a win for me. Well, the Ring of Fire is also similar to that. Against Phoenix, a lot of the time they'll put out their Add Up to the Waves and some other dude, and they'll attack me with not the Add Up to the Waves. They'll give covert to their other dude and then attack me. And then I'll attack with the Ring of Fire and be like, well, you can either block or I can dishonor your guys here as 0/0. So then you're going to have to spend cards out of your hand even to get a ring effect, even if I don't block, which is like, it's not that great. So Ring of Fire and Ring of Water are kind of similar in that they, against high glory characters, they serve similar functions. They encourage your opponent strongly to defend, or you neuter their next conflict. And then the Ring of Void is the other one. Is that water is fine. It's just so situational. It's all about what you can do with it. It's an extra value card. Ring of Water is great when you're going second and you can defend their first conflict. Then Ring of Water your second conflict to unbow your defender and then use it in your second conflict. It's also very strong when they have a strong bow target, like like a big guy that happens to have no fate, or even like a little guy, a high value little guy. Like a lot of times people with Ring of Water might Bayushi Liars because a -3 for 1 is still a -3. Void is a really great long term. Just a great long term ring. So you got, oh yeah. So fire, you got to think about. So when you Ring of Fire, you're going to honor or dishonor one of their guys, and they don't get to honor or dishonor one of your guys. And you have to remember it's also somewhat similar to Earth and Air in that it affects the honor totals. It's a less noticeable effect because you're just going to get half the effect, but because it gives you an immediate stat change on one side or the other, it's definitely very, very valuable. And they're gonna, maybe they won't actually lose the honor, but they're gonna have to use a card effect or a ring effect or something. If they don't do something, they're gonna lose an honor or you're gonna gain an honor. And in the meantime, the stat bonus is often very meaningful. So, and then Void, of course, when you take the Void Ring, you get to remove a fate from them, but you also prevent them from removing a fate from you. And since we just talked about how you should be putting fate on all your guys because it's very strong, it's very high value, because passing first is good, then Ring of Void is something that you should always consider. I think it's the least important of the big rings. To me, Earth is the most important. In the style of decks that I play, I go for Earth a lot. Scorpion conflict cards are really strong. Discarding cards from them is really strong. I sometimes learn their splash earlier than they want me to because I discard cards. And then Ring of Fire is also super important in Scorpion, both because I'm trying to dishonor them sometimes, or because I want to use my Cunning Magistrate, or because I bought a favored niece and I want to honor her, or whatever. I want to for shame to bow somebody, but I don't feel like using away the Scorpion for shame because 2 cards is a lot to just bow someone. So Earth and Fire are the 2 big ones for me in my deck with my game plan. And Void is definitely one I think about every turn. Sometimes I use. And then water and air, situational, and often worth it if they have fate. So that's another thing. You should always try to find a way to make it worth your time to get a ring with fate on it. Like if you can find a way to take the rings that have fate on them, do it, because that extra fate is so strong because you're getting it and they aren't getting it. The only time that I often will leave fate on rings is if I think, like, so let's say there's a fate on the Ring of Air. Since I play Scorpion, it's usually pretty bad for my opponent to take the Ring of Air because they're often turning on my stronghold, or it's just not as significant to me. So if I think, okay, if I'm second player and there's a fate on the Ring of Air, and I can take a ring that will be useful to them, then I will often do that. Now, it does suck for me if they take the fate, but especially if I think that there's another ring that they will. So, like, I'll take the Ring of Air, Ring of Earth instead of the Ring of Air, and figure, okay, well, they're going to take the Ring of Void because I didn't take it, and they want to wreck my board. They're going to leave that fate on the Ring of Air, and then I'm going to get it next turn. Or they take the Ring of Air, in which case they didn't take the Ring of Void, and maybe I can take it on my second conflict. And, like, even if they gained a fate from the Ring of Air, then I take the Ring of Void and take the fate away. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes, because the Ring of Air is not the highest value ring, sometimes it's worth gambling and hoping that they take something other than the Ring of Air, and then you can get it with 2 fate. All right, and then finally, the thing I want to talk about is committing to combat. It's one of the hardest choices that you're going to make, especially in early turns when you have a large hand, almost guaranteed, if you're bidding, high, which you should be, at least mid. And there aren't any really hard and fast rules, but I want you to think about, when you're thinking about, okay, I attacked with 2 force. He defended with 2 force. He played an Ornate Fan on his guy. So now he's at 4 and I'm at 2. And I have an Ornate Fan in my hand. I could also play an Ornate Fan. Should I? And the answer is, it depends so much. A lot of times I fight more for the Ring of Earth than I do for other rings, because if we both play 3 cards and then I win the Ring of Earth, and then they discard a card and I draw a card, that's mostly a win. Most of the time that's a win. Now, it does depend on if I had to spend any fate on those cards. And one of the hardest things to evaluate is, do I need those cards later? And then in this deck, I often will give up our early conflicts because there's a certain part of my game plan is to dishonor their entire board on turn 2 or 3, and then abuse the Cunning Magistrate's awesome utility to blank a bunch of their characters, or make their characters unable to contribute force to the battle. So I often will not commit to combat early on. And man, it's just so like, do you have to think about committing to combat? Okay, what clan is my opponent? How are they playing? How many cards? How many cards in hand? How important is the ring? Do I need my? Do I have the resources to take this? You should assume that they'll play Bonsai plus Katana, or Court Games plus Fan, or For Shame. You should assume that they're gonna, if they have a hand of 8 or 9 cards, and they have a courtier in the battle, you should assume they're gonna be able to play Court Games and a Fan, or Court Games and For Shame, or for Fan and For Shame if they want to. You should assume they're going to be able to play Bonsai and Katana. So the question is, so you should ask yourself, can I beat the above plays? Is it worth it to trade cards in hand? And how bad is it if I trade cards in hand and then lose? Sometimes you have to take risks, but the early game is not always the time to take them. And if it's going to be if you're going to trade 4 cards for 4 cards and then still lose the the conflict, that's usually super bad for you. So yeah, that's usually super bad for you. I wouldn't usually risk that. If you're playing a super aggro early game deck and you've got a Bonsai and 2 Katanas and a Legion of One in your hand, and you're like, you know what, I'm just going to smoke him. Like, he might think that he's going to win this combat, but I'm actually not only going to win, but I'm going to break, and go for it. That's what your deck's game plan is, go for it. But if you've got a more of a control style deck with a lot of control effects in it, like I do in mine, you're playing for the mid and late game. You're controlling what they can do. You're snowballing your advantage. You don't have to commit early. Right? So you got to know your deck, and you want to see what kind of cards they played. Like, sometimes I'll poke, and so he puts on the Fan, right? Maybe I put on 1 Fan and see what else he does. And if he plays the Court Games, maybe I just call it a day. I'm like, whatever. We traded fans, and ideally on my guy with 1 Fate so I can use it again. And he wasted a Court Games on a guy that's not going to be around for that long, so whatever. I don't care. Because some decks don't run a lot of pumps. Some decks run a lot of utility cards and a lot of different kind of cards. So you kind of got to get a read on what kind of deck your opponent's playing. All right. So and then the last thing I want to talk about is win condition. This is a hard one, and I think a lot of people misplay because they don't have a clear understanding of their win condition. Right. So for my deck, this ambush deck, my win condition is my opponent is at 6 honor, and I have 4 dishonor cards in hand. That's like a arbitrary, but I think that if I can get if I and he has people on the board who can be dishonored. If I can get my opponent down to 2 honor over the next couple of turns, I can probably kill him because I can take Ring of Air, and I can double Bonsai and then use my Stronghold and take Ring of Air, and all of a sudden he's got 4 dishonored guys and 4 honor, and he is under immense pressure to do something. Okay, my second win condition, my other win condition. I've broken 3 provinces, and I can break the 4th. And that usually entails like having a Cunning Magistrate in my hand, and they've got a bunch of dishonored guys, or I've still got some pumps, because that's why it's hard to use Bonsai in the early game, because sometimes you really need it in the late game. But I still maybe got an ambush or a charge. I've got enough to break, or I've got a fate worse than death. So I'm like, well, he's gonna, defend with this one really good guy, and I'm gonna send it home. Um, and you have to assume that they have answers. So like, if my fate worse than death is my game plan to win the game, I better have a Forged Edict to back it up, or I should be able to get the favor, make sure he doesn't have more honored characters than I do, and dishonor all his courtiers, so that it cannot be canceled. Right. So my win condition is, I'm looking for is I'm looking to set up a situation in which I've broken 3 provinces, and I have Cunning Magistrate, or maybe I just have an overwhelming board state where I just have a bunch of guys and they have a bunch of dishonored guys, or I have Cunning Magistrate and they have a bunch of dishonored guys, so I can attack their province and they can't really do anything about it. Or I have cards in my hand that are getting dishonor guys, so I attack with a Cunning Magistrate. Or I just do a regular attack. They defend it. I play the Magistrate. I dishonor all their guys. Looks like I'm trying to win. Then I play the Magistrate, and bam, now I am winning. Right? And you have to sort of understand what your win condition is and try to mold the board toward that win condition. So let's say you have a Katana in hand, and you're playing Dragon, right? Now, the question you have to ask yourself is it worth playing now? Because maybe your win condition is, I get a Nintendo Master and break, 4 provinces in 2 turns. Well, then maybe you need to save the Katana for when you get the Master, and you need to find another way to play this turn. It's okay to accept a small tempo loss now for the possibility of a strong tempo later. A lot of this game is about not just having good cards, but playing them in an order that really maximizes the potential of each card. So you have to understand what your deck wants to do, understand how the board has to look for it to do that thing, and then save the cards you need for the moment when they're actually effective. And use the rings to mold the board into the board state that you desire to win. So I hope this has helped. It's maybe a little bit longer than I had planned, but hey, there's a lot to this game. So good luck.